James had learned long ago to keep his head down around his mother-in-law Margaret. From the very beginning, she had made it clear that she didn't approve of him. She had always imagined her daughter, Emily, marrying a doctor, a lawyer, or at the very least, someone with an executive title next to his name. But instead, Emily had chosen James, a man who, in Margaret's eyes, was nothing more than a glorified driver. James worked as a personal chauffeur for high-profile clients, a job he took seriously and performed with quiet dignity. He had built a reputation for his professionalism, reliability, and discretion. His clients trusted him with more than just their transportation. They confided in him, relied on him for logistics, and in some cases, even turned to him for advice on security. But to Margaret, none of that mattered. To her, he was just a man who opened car doors and drove people from point A to point B. Margaret had never been subtle about her feelings. The first time she met James, she didn't even try to hide her disappointment. Emily had brought him to a family dinner, and Margaret had eyed him up and down, her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. "So James," she had said, swirling her wine glass in her manicured hand, "Emily tells me you're a driver." "Yes, ma'am," James had replied with a polite smile. Margaret had raised an eyebrow. "A chauffeur," she corrected. "That's a fancy word for a driver, isn't it?" James had simply nodded. He had faced this kind of judgment before. People often assumed that because he drove cars for a living, he must not have ambition, intelligence, or any real prospects. But he knew better than to argue. From that moment on, Margaret had made it her mission to remind him of his supposed place. Every family gathering, every holiday dinner, every casual conversation, she never missed an opportunity to make a snide remark. "Must be nice, getting paid to sit around in a car all day," she once said at a Thanksgiving dinner. "James, do you get a uniform with that job?" "Oh, I suppose they don't require much beyond a black suit, do they?" "I always tell Emily she could have married someone successful, someone who could provide for her properly, but I suppose love makes people do foolish things." James had learned to take it in stride, but it never got easier. Emily, to her credit, always defended him. She would snap at her mother, tell her to stop, remind her that James worked hard and earned a good living. But Margaret never listened. She would wave Emily off, laugh, and say she was just joking, just teasing. But it wasn't a joke. It was constant, cutting, and cruel. The only person who never joined in Margaret's belittling was Emily's father, Richard. He was a quiet, observant man who rarely got involved in the petty conversations his wife indulged in. He never spoke down to James, but he never openly defended him either. James always had the impression that Richard was watching, waiting, as if assessing him in silence. Despite Margaret's disapproval, James and Emily had built a strong, happy marriage. They had their own home, their own routines, and their own dreams. James loved his work, even if it wasn't prestigious by Margaret's standards. He had worked his way up from driving taxis to working with elite clients, managing complicated schedules, handling last-minute itinerary changes, and ensuring the security of the people he transported. It was a skill, one he had honed over years of experience. But none of that mattered to Margaret. The breaking point came on Richard's last birthday before he passed. The family had gathered at the estate, a grand home that Margaret loved to flaunt. James had driven Emily there in one of the high-end vehicles he used for work, but before he could even step inside, Margaret had made a point to humiliate him in front of the guests. As James held the door open for Emily, Margaret clicked her tongue and smirked. "You might as well stay out here, James," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Isn't that what chauffeurs do? Wait outside." A few of the guests chuckled awkwardly. Emily's face burned with anger, but before she could respond, Richard spoke up. "That's enough, Margaret," he said, his voice firm. It was one of the only times he had ever directly called her out. Margaret had huffed, clearly irritated, but she had said no more. James, however, noticed something strange. Richard wasn't just scolding his wife. He was looking at James with something else in his expression, something almost like quiet respect. That night, as the guests left and James and Emily prepared to head home, Richard pulled James aside. "You've got patience," he said. "More patience than most men in your position would have." James wasn't sure how to respond, so he simply nodded. Richard sighed. "I know Margaret can be difficult, But I see what kind of man you are, James. I see how hard you work. And I want you to know it doesn't go unnoticed. It was the closest thing to approval James had ever received from the older man. And in that moment he felt something shift. Maybe, just maybe, Richard didn't see him the way Margaret did. Maybe he saw something more. But James had no way of knowing just how much Richard truly saw, or what it would mean when the time came to read his will. The day of the will reading arrived with a heavy air of anticipation and tension. The family gathered in the stately law office of Richard's longtime attorney, Mr. Donovan, a meticulous and serious man who had handled the family's affairs for decades. The room itself felt intimidating with its dark mahogany bookshelves, the scent of old paper and leather filling the air. James had never been in a place like this for anything personal. He was used to waiting outside in the car, while his high-profile clients handled their business. But today, he was seated among the family, facing the same future-altering moment as everyone else. Margaret sat at the head of the long conference table, dressed in black despite the funeral having taken place a week prior. She had always enjoyed the image of propriety, of being the grieving widow, though James suspected her mind was already racing ahead to what she would inherit. Next to her sat Emily, her fingers nervously interlocked. She had no expectations, she loved her father, but she knew how traditional inheritance worked. The estate, the money, the business, it would all go to Margaret. That was how things were done in their family. James, however, had no expectations at all. He was there for Emily, to be supportive. He had never once thought Richard would leave anything to him. After all, as Margaret had always reminded him, he was just the chauffeur. Mr. Donovan cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses before beginning. As you all know, Richard had specific wishes regarding his estate. He was a meticulous planner, and every decision outlined in this document was carefully considered. He glanced around the room before continuing. Let's begin. The first portions of the will were expected: various charitable donations, trust funds for extended family members, a few small but thoughtful bequests to close friends. Then came the major assets. To my wife Margaret, Mr. Donovan read, I leave our primary residence, along with the accompanying assets needed to maintain it. Additionally, I leave a monthly allowance, the amount of which has been outlined separately, ensuring she is provided for in the manner to which she has been accustomed. Margaret's expression shifted slightly. An allowance? That was a cold, calculated way to ensure she wouldn't squander the fortune. She expected full control, yet Richard had clearly put safeguards in place. Then came the unexpected. To my daughter, Emily, Mr. Donovan continued, I leave a significant portion of my liquid assets, as well as my personal investment portfolio. Emily, I have always admired your independence and strength, and I trust that you will use these resources wisely. Emily's eyes widened slightly. She had expected something, of course, but she hadn't anticipated such a generous allocation. However, what followed stunned the entire room. To James, Mr. Donovan said, and in that instant, Margaret let out a scoff. James, she interrupted, laughing lightly as if the idea was absurd. Why is James even mentioned in this? Mr. Donovan gave her a sharp look, but didn't pause. To James he repeated, I leave a controlling share in my private transportation company, as well as a financial package to ensure its stability for years to come. Silence fell over the room. James felt his breath hitch, his mind struggling to process what he had just heard. He wasn't sure he had heard correctly. Margaret, on the other hand, was not silent for long. You what? She sputtered, her voice rising in pitch. That's a mistake. That must be a mistake. Mr. Donovan remained composed. There is no mistake, Miss Turner. Richard made this decision deliberately. James has been entrusted with the business. Margaret's face twisted with disbelief, then anger. That company is worth millions, she snapped. Why would he? He's just the chauffeur. Emily reached for James's hand under the table, squeezing it tightly. But James was still in shock, barely able to grasp the reality of what was happening. Margaret turned her fury toward Mr. Donovan. You're telling me that my husband, left a multimillion-dollar company to him? To a man who drives cars for a living? Mr. Donovan gave a small sigh, as if he had expected this reaction. He flipped through the pages of the will and pulled out a separate letter. This is a personal statement from Richard, addressed to all of you, explaining his reasoning. He unfolded the letter and began reading. I know that my decision may come as a surprise to some, but I assure you it is not made lightly. Over the years I have observed James closely. I have seen his dedication, his patience, and most of all his integrity. Unlike many people I have encountered in business, James never asked for anything. He never sought favors, never expected handouts, and never tried to gain an advantage through his association with this family. I have trusted James not just with my transportation, but with my safety, my schedule, and my private affairs. He has handled it all with unwavering reliability. What many of you may not know is that over the past few years, I have consulted James on numerous occasions regarding the management and expansion of my transportation company. His insights, drawn from years of experience in the industry, have proven invaluable. James is not just a chauffeur. He is a businessman, even if he does not yet see himself as one. He understands people, logistics, and operations in ways that few others do. That is why I have chosen to leave this company in his hands. I have no doubt that he will continue to build and strengthen what I have worked for, ensuring its success far into the future. Mr. Donovan lowered the letter and looked around the room. The silence was deafening. Margaret was still staring, her mouth slightly open, as if her mind couldn't quite comprehend what she had just heard. This is insane, she finally said, her voice quieter now, almost to herself. This is absolutely insane. James, still gripping Emily's hand, felt a wave of emotions crash over him. Gratitude, shock, responsibility. He had never once considered himself the heir to a multimillion-dollar business. He had never seen himself as anything other than a hard-working man, trying to make an honest living. And yet, Richard had seen something in him that no one else had. Margaret turned to Emily, as if looking for support. You can't seriously be okay with this, she said, her voice desperate now. He's giving away our company to... Emily cut her off. Dad's company, she corrected. And he made his choice. Margaret slumped back in her chair, shaking her head in disbelief. Mr. Donovan cleared his throat. There is, of course, a transition plan outlined in the will. James will have access to advisors should he need them. Richard was confident that, in time, he would prove himself capable of this role. James finally found his voice, though it was quiet. I don't even know what to say. Mr. Donovan gave him a small nod. I believe Richard would simply want you to say that you'll do your best. James swallowed hard and nodded. Then that's what I'll do. Margaret said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The will had been read, and Richard's wishes were clear. The chauffeur was no longer just the chauffeur. James left the law office in a daze. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him, heavy and overwhelming. He had walked into that room expecting nothing. At most, a polite mention in the will. Perhaps some small token of Richard's appreciation. Instead, he had walked out the legal owner of a multimillion-dollar transportation company. The very business Richard had spent decades building. Emily stayed close by his side as they walked to the parking garage. She could sense the storm of emotions swirling inside him. He hadn't said much since the reading, only responding with nods and murmured acknowledgments when spoken to. Now, as they reached their car, she gently touched his arm. Are you okay? She asked softly. James let out a slow breath and rubbed his hands over his face. I don't know, he admitted. I still can't believe it. I mean, why me? He had business partners. People who actually know how to run a company. Emily smiled faintly. Apparently, he thought you knew how to run it too. James shook his head, his mind still struggling to process everything. He wasn't a CEO. He was a driver. He had always taken pride in his work, but it had never defined him as anything more than that. Until now. As they drove home, Margaret's furious reaction played over and over in his head. The way her face had contorted in disbelief, the sheer outrage in her voice. She had spent years dismissing him, belittling his profession, making sure he knew that in her eyes, he was nothing more than a servant. Now, she had to face the reality that her husband had placed more trust in him than in her. When they arrived home, James sat on the couch, staring at nothing in particular. Emily sat beside him, tucking her legs under herself and watching him carefully. You don't have to do this, you know, she said after a moment. If it's too much, there are ways to step back. You could sell your share. Find someone to run the company for you. James shook his head. No, he said, surprising himself with how firm his voice sounded. Richard trusted me. I don't know why, but he did. I can't just walk away from that. Emily studied him, then smiled. That sounds like something Dad would have wanted to hear. But knowing he couldn't walk away was one thing. Figuring out what to do next was another. The following day, James received a call from Mr. Donovan. There are a few matters that need to be handled right away, the lawyer said. I've scheduled a meeting with the company's board of directors for tomorrow. They'll want to hear from you. James felt his stomach tighten. He had been inside corporate buildings before, but always in the lobby, waiting for his clients to finish their meetings. Now he was the one expected to sit at the head of a conference table, speaking to executives who had been in this industry far longer than he had. The next morning, James dressed in the best suit he owned and drove to the company's headquarters. Walking through the lobby, he felt out of place. He wasn't here to pick someone up. He was the someone. When he entered the boardroom, all eyes turned to him. A dozen men and women in expensive suits, most of them older than him, sat around a sleek glass table. Some looked curious, others skeptical. He couldn't blame them. He wasn't sure he'd take himself seriously in their position either. A man at the far end of the table stood. He was in his 60s with silver hair and sharp, assessing eyes. Mr. Carter, he said, extending a hand. I'm William Harrington, the company's CFO. We all knew Richard had something planned, but I have to say none of us expected this. James shook his hand. Neither did I, he admitted, earning a few chuckles from the room. Harrington gestured for him to sit. Let's get straight to the point. We were all under the impression that Richard's wife, or a senior executive, would take over in the event of his passing. Instead, the will names you. You have no corporate experience, no background in finance or operations. So I have to ask, Mr. Carter, how do you plan to run this company? James felt the weight of the question settle on his shoulders. He could see it in their eyes. They expected him to fail. Margaret had probably already convinced them he was nothing more than a fluke, an impulsive decision made by a man whose judgment had been clouded. But Richard had believed in him. James straightened in his seat. I won't pretend I have all the answers, he said honestly. I know I'm not a businessman, but I do know this industry. I've spent years in it, working from the ground up. I know what customers expect. I know what it takes to provide top-tier service. And I know that if Richard trusted me with this company, then I owe it to him, and to all of you, to do my best to keep it running. A few board members exchanged glances. Some seemed unimpressed. But Harrington leaned back in his chair, watching James closely. That's a respectable answer, he said. But this is more than just service. This is logistics, contracts, legalities. Do you have a plan for how you'll handle that? James hesitated, then exhaled. I don't yet. But I'm willing to learn. And I'm willing to listen to the people who do know. That seemed to satisfy some of them. Others not so much. By the end of the meeting, James wasn't sure where he stood. Some board members seemed willing to give him a chance, while others looked like they were already counting down the days until his inevitable failure. But there was one thing he knew for certain. He couldn't do this alone. That night, as he sat with Emily at the kitchen table, he laid out everything that had happened. I need help, he admitted. If I try to do this all on my own, I'll crash and burn. Emily nodded. Then find the right people. Dad trusted you for a reason. But that doesn't mean you have to figure everything out overnight. James thought about it. He needed mentors, advisors, people who knew the business side of things. And maybe, just maybe, if he played this right, he could prove to everyone, including himself, that he was the right person for this job. The next morning, he made a decision. He wasn't just going to survive in this role. He was going to own it. James stood before the large window in his office, staring out at the sprawling city below. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over the skyline. But despite the beauty of the view, James felt nothing but a deep sense of pressure, of uncertainty. It had been a few months since the will reading, and while the dust had settled somewhat, the weight of his new responsibility had not. Every day he came to the office, put on his suit, and acted like a man who knew what he was doing. But inside he was still the same chauffeur, unsure, unprepared, overwhelmed. He had taken Richard's trust seriously, but the reality of running a multimillion-dollar transportation company was much harder than he had imagined. The board of directors, while grudgingly respectful of his position, continued to watch him with skepticism, their questions always sharp, their expectations always high. He had spent countless hours poring over financial reports, trying to understand the intricacies of the business. He'd met with the management team, trying to learn from their experience, but each meeting only reinforced his feeling of inadequacy. He was in over his head and he knew it. But there was one thing he could count on: Emily. She had been by his side through every twist and turn, offering encouragement when he felt like giving up, reminding him of the trust Richard had placed in him. Emily had always believed in him, and it was her unwavering support that kept him going. That evening, after a particularly grueling day of meetings with the board, James found himself once again at home, sitting at the kitchen table with Emily. He had tried to keep his frustration hidden, but she could tell. She always could. "You're doing it again, James," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You're trying to do everything on your own." James sighed and leaned back in his chair. "I don't know what else to do, Em. Every time I think I've got a handle on something, something else comes up. The contracts, the logistics, the legal issues, there's so much to manage. And no matter how much I try to learn, it feels like I'm just not good enough." Emily reached across the table and took his hand. "You are good enough. You've come this far because you're smart, you're capable, and you've got something that they don't: integrity. People don't trust you because of the job you do. They trust you because of who you are. But you can't do this alone. You've got to ask for help when you need it." James looked at her, her eyes filled with compassion and belief in him. He wanted to believe her, but the doubt still lingered. How could he possibly manage everything on his own? The next morning, as he was preparing for another day at the office, his phone rang. It was Mr. Donovan, the family attorney. "James, I hope I'm not disturbing you." Mr. Donovan's voice came through the phone. "But there's something you should know. I've been reviewing Richard's estate, and there's an aspect of the will that I believe you need to address sooner rather than later." James felt his stomach churn. "What's this about?" "There's a clause in the will regarding the company's future growth, and your role in it. Richard set aside a substantial sum for reinvestment into the business, something that will be crucial if you intend to take the company to the next level." "I don't understand," James said, trying to keep his voice steady. "What do you mean, reinvestment?" Mr. Donovan paused before responding. "What I'm suggesting is that there's an opportunity for you to bring in some outside expertise, business consultants, financial advisors, people who can guide you and help you develop a strategic plan. Richard foresaw that you might need this kind of support, and he made provisions for it." James was silent for a moment, the weight of Mr. Donovan's words sinking in. Richard had known. Richard had known that he would need help, and had planned for it. James realized that the pressure he felt wasn't because he wasn't capable, but because he had tried to shoulder it all alone, convinced that he had to. "Thank you," James said finally. "I'll consider it. I'll look into finding someone." Later that day, James made a call to a well-known business consultant, a woman named Sarah Westbrook, who had worked with other companies in similar industries. After a brief conversation, they scheduled a meeting for the following week. It was the first step toward accepting that he didn't have to do everything himself. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and preparations. James worked closely with Sarah to develop a strategic plan that would guide the company's growth. They focused on improving the customer experience, streamlining logistics, and expanding the company's fleet. Slowly, James began to feel more confident, more capable. The weight on his shoulders didn't disappear, but it became more manageable, like a load he could share with others. A few weeks later, the company held its annual shareholder meeting. The board was present, as were several key clients and investors. James was nervous. He had to present the plan that he and Sarah had developed, and he knew that the board would be watching him closely. When it was his turn to speak, he stood up, feeling the eyes of the room on him. But instead of the usual nerves, a calm certainty settled over him. He was no longer the chauffeur. He was the CEO of this company. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady. "I know many of you have had concerns about the company's direction, and I understand why. Change can be unsettling, especially after the loss of someone as significant as Richard. But Richard left this company in my hands for a reason. He believed in the potential of this business, and he trusted me to take it forward. And I'm ready to do that. He paused, glancing around the room. Some of the board members still looked skeptical, but others seemed willing to give him a chance. I've spent the last few weeks working with a team of experts to develop a comprehensive plan that will ensure the continued growth and success of this company. We're focusing on our customers, on our employees, and on modernizing our operations to meet the demands of the future. We're going to continue building on the foundation that Richard laid, but we're also going to take this company to new heights. James's voice grew stronger as he spoke. This company is about more than just transportation. It's about people. It's about reliability, trust, and service. And that's something I believe in wholeheartedly. I'm asking for your trust, for your support, as we move forward into the next chapter. When he finished speaking, the room was silent for a few moments. Then, to his surprise, one of the board members, William Harrington, the CFO, stood up and began to applaud. Slowly, others joined in, until the entire room was clapping. James blinked in disbelief. For the first time since he had taken over, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Later that evening, as James and Emily sat down for dinner, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in months. They had come so far, and he knew that the road ahead would still have challenges. But he was no longer afraid. "I think I can do this," he said quietly, looking across the table at Emily. She smiled, her eyes warm with pride. "I never doubted you for a second." James reached across the table and took her hand. He knew that he still had a long way to go, but he had finally found his footing. And with Emily by his side, and the company moving in the right direction, he felt ready to face whatever came next. It wasn't just about the business anymore. It was about proving to himself that he could live up to the trust Richard had placed in him. It was about taking ownership of his future, and embracing the man he had become. Not the chauffeur, not the outsider, but the leader of a thriving company, one that he had helped shape with his own hands. And as he looked at Emily, he knew that the next chapter of their lives had only just begun.